Sterling stood frozen in the middle of the rotting wooden shack. His expensive leather shoes felt heavy on the dirt floor, but his heart felt heavier. There, sitting on a broken stool, was a small boy named Zion, clutching an old, soot-covered lighter. It was his father's lighter, the one that was supposed to be buried in the ash 15 years ago. Sterling's breath hitched as he looked into the boy's eyes. They weren't just familiar. They were his own. The same piercing amber gaze that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. How could this child be here? And how could he possess a relic from a dead man? But the real shock came from the shadows. A woman stepped forward, her face half hidden by a worn shawl, her hands trembling as she held a bowl of medicine. Sterling's world tilted. It was Odessa, his mother, the woman he had wept for at a closed casket funeral more than a decade ago. She was alive. "Mother," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. Odessa didn't run to him. She didn't cry. Instead, she gasped in terror and retreated into the darkness, shielding the boy as if Sterling were the monster. Why was she hiding in this ruin? Why did she let him believe she was dead for 15 years? And most importantly, who was the boy with his eyes, and why was he the key to a secret someone was still willing to kill for? The silence in the shack was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of Sterling's own breathing. He took a step forward, his polished shoe crunching against a piece of charred wood. Odessa flinched. She pressed Zion's head against her hip, her eyes darting toward the back door, a flimsy sheet of plywood held up by rusty hinges. She wasn't looking at Sterling like a long-lost son. She was looking at him like a threat. "Don't come any closer, Sterling," she rasped. Her voice was thin, like parchment paper rubbing together. Sterling stopped. His eyes fell to her hands. They were scarred, the skin pulled tight and shiny from old burns. But it was what she was wearing that made his blood run cold. Around her neck hung a heavy gold chain. It was his father's wedding band, the one Sterling was told had melted in the fire that took her life. He looked back at the boy Zion. The child hadn't made a sound. He just sat there, staring at Sterling with those haunting amber eyes. Zion reached out and placed the soot-covered lighter on a small wooden crate. Next to the lighter lay a folded yellow envelope with a government seal. It was dated only 2 days ago. Sterling's heart hammered against his ribs. Someone had been here. Someone was sending mail to a dead woman at an abandoned address. "You were buried, Mother," Sterling said, his voice trembling. "I stood at the cemetery. I paid for the headstone. Who is in that grave?" Odessa didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed a small burlap bag from the table and hissed at the boy in a language Sterling didn't recognize. She began backing toward the rear exit, her eyes never leaving the window behind Sterling. Suddenly, a low hum vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of a heavy engine idling just down the road. Odessa's face went pale. "They followed you," she whispered, her terror finally breaking through. "You shouldn't have come back, Sterling. You've opened the door for them." Before Sterling could ask who they were, Zion pointed a small, trembling finger at Sterling's chest. Not at his heart, but at the luxury watch on his wrist. The boy's lips moved, forming a single word without a sound. Sterling looked down at his watch. The glass was fogging up from the inside, a tiny red light flashing beneath the dial that he had never noticed before, a tracker. He wasn't just here to find his mother. He had led a predator straight to her doorstep. Sterling ripped the luxury watch from his wrist and threw it onto the dirt floor. The red light inside the dial blinked like a dying eye, mocking him outside. The low hum of the idling engine grew louder. A black SUV with tinted windows crept into view, stopping just inches from the edge of the tall, dry grass surrounding the shack. Sterling looked at his mother. She looked pathetic. Her clothes were rags sewn together with fishing line. Her hair, once thick and proud, was hidden under a grease-stained wrap. She lived in a house that smelled like rot and wet ash, while he lived in a penthouse with heated marble floors. He felt a surge of cold judgment. How could a woman of her blood choose to crawl in the dirt for 15 years? Is this what you wanted? Mother Sterling's voice was sharp, cutting through the humid air. To live like an animal while I built an empire to honor your ghost. Odessa didn't flinch at his words. She grabbed a rusted iron poker from the fireplace, her scarred knuckles turning white. She wasn't looking at his face anymore. She was looking at his shoes, $3,000 Italian leather, now coated in the same filth she called home. Your empire is built on a lie, Sterling, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the black SUV outside. And that watch you just threw away. It wasn't just tracking you. It was paying for Zion's silence. Sterling froze. Zion sat perfectly still, his amber eyes moving from Sterling to the black vehicle. The boy reached into the burlap bag Odessa had packed and pulled out a stack of pristine, uncirculated $100 bills. They were bound in a blue paper strap from a bank Sterling owned. His own money. His own bank. Suddenly, the passenger window of the SUV rolled down just an inch. A hand emerged, not to point a weapon, but to toss something into the yard. It was a small, white teddy bear, identical to the one Sterling had been buried with as a child. Zion didn't look afraid. He looked expectant. He took a step toward the door, but Odessa blocked him with the iron poker. Don't, or she hissed. Sterling looked from the money to the teddy bear, then back to the black car. His mind raced. If his mother was dead to the world, why was his bank account feeding her? And why did the person in that car know a secret that only a mother and son should share? The SUV door began to creak open. Sterling stepped toward it, his hand reaching for the heavy silver handle. But a sudden, sharp click sounded from behind him. He turned around. Zion wasn't holding the lighter anymore. He was holding a small, black remote with a single red button, and his thumb was hovering right over the edge. Sterling, get back, Odessa screamed, but it was too late. The boy pressed the button. The moment Zion pressed the button, Sterling braced for an explosion. But there was no fire, instead a heavy, mechanical thud echoed from beneath the dirt floor. The shack groaned as a hidden compartment near the fireplace slid open, revealing a rusted metal lockbox. Sterling stared at the box, then back at the boys. Zion's thumb was still trembling on the remote, but his gaze remained fixed on the black SUV outside. The vehicle didn't move. The door remained half open, a dark silhouette sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat. Open it, Sterling, Odessa whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying urgency. Open it before they decide to come out of that car. Sterling knelt in the filth, his expensive suit jacket dragging in the ash. He grabbed the handle of the lockbox. It was ice cold. He forced the lid open with a sharp jerk. Inside lay no gold, no jewelry. It was filled with hundreds of microcassette tapes, each one labeled with a date and a name. His hand hovered over a tape labeled with his father's name and the date of the fire. But as he reached for it, something caught his eye at the very bottom of the box, a fresh, white plastic hospital wristband. It bore the name Zion Sterling and a birth date from just 6 years ago. Sterling felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at Zion. The boy had his eyes. He had his last name. But Sterling had never seen this child in his life. Who is his father? Odessa, Sterling demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Odessa didn't answer. She was staring at the black SUV. The figure in the driver's seat finally stepped out. It was a man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, his face obscured by the shadow of the porch. He held a second white teddy bear in his hand. The man walked toward the shack with a slow, rhythmic limp. As he stepped into the sliver of light coming through the door, Sterling's heart stopped. The man was Thaddeus, Sterling's most trusted lawyer and the man who had handled his mother's estate after her death. But Thaddeus was looking at Sterling. He looked at Zion and smiled a hollow, predatory smile. The boy has been waiting for his father to return, Sterling, Thaddeus said, his voice smooth as silk. But he wasn't waiting for you. Thaddeus reached into his pocket and pulled out an identical remote to the one Zion held. He pointed it at the boy. "Odessa, tell him," Thaddeus commanded. "Tell Sterling whose blood is really running through that boy's veins." Odessa dropped the iron poker. She slumped against the wall, her face a mask of pure agony. She looked at Sterling, her eyes brimming with tears of shame. "He's not your son, Sterling," she choked out. "He's your brother." Sterling's world shattered. His father had died 15 years ago. If Zion was only 6, then the secret of the fire was much darker than a simple insurance fraud. But before Sterling could process the lie, Thaddeus turned the remote toward the SUV. The trunk popped open, and a woman, bruised, gagged, and bound, was shoved out onto the grass by a second man. Sterling didn't recognize her face, but he recognized the locket around her neck. It was the same one he had given his fiancée, Clara, before she disappeared 3 months ago. "No," Thaddeus whispered. "Let's talk about the real reason your mother stayed dead." Sterling lunged toward Thaddeus, but the second man from the SUV stepped into the light, leveling a cold, black barrel of a pistol at Sterling's chest. Sterling stopped. His breath was coming in sharp, jagged gasps. He looked at Clara, bound and trembling on the grass, then back at his mother, who was shaking her head in a silent, desperate plea. "This is a lie," Sterling roared, his voice bouncing off the thin wooden walls. "My father died 15 years ago. I saw the body. I saw the dental records." Thaddeus chuckled, a dry sound that carried no warmth. He tossed the second white teddy bear onto the dirt floor. It landed right next to the lockbox of tapes. "You saw what I wanted you to see, Sterling," Thaddeus said. "I was the one who handled the records. I was the one who signed the death certificate. Your father didn't die in that fire. He just needed to disappear so he could keep building the shadow side of your family's wealth." Sterling shook his head violently. He grabbed one of the microcassettes from the box, his knuckles white. He wanted to crush it. He wanted to burn this entire shack to the ground. "If he's alive, then where is he?" Sterling demanded. "And why is Zion here? Why is Clara in the back of your car?" Instead of answering, Thaddeus nodded toward Zion. The boy hadn't moved an inch. He was staring at the second teddy bear on the floor with an intensity that wasn't natural for a child. Zion reached out and picked it up. He squeezed its paw. A small, metallic click sounded from inside the toy. Suddenly, a voice began to play from a hidden speaker in the bear's stomach. It was a deep, gravelly voice, a voice Sterling hadn't heard since he was a teenager. It was his father. "Sterling," the recording said, the audio distorted by static. "If you are hearing this, it means you've finally found the shack. It also means you've made a choice you can never take back." Sterling dropped the tape in his hand. He took a staggering step toward Zion, his eyes wide with horror. "That boy," Sterling whispered, looking at his mother. "He isn't just my brother. He's the reason the fire started, isn't he?" Odessa covered her face with her scarred hands, her sobs finally breaking through. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. Thaddeus stepped closer, the limp in his walk more pronounced. He reached out and grabbed Zion by the shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. He looked up at Thaddeus as if he were waiting for an order. "The fire wasn't an accident, Sterling," Thaddeus whispered. "It was a ritual. And Zion was the only thing that was supposed to survive." Suddenly, the woman on the grass, Clara, began to thrash violently. She managed to spit out the gag for a split second. "Sterling, look at his hands," she screamed before the guard kicked her back into silence. Sterling looked down. Zion was still holding the teddy bear. But as the boy's grip tightened, the skin on his small hands began to change. Beneath the dirt and grime, a series of strange, glowing numbers began to pulse under the boy's skin. A serial number. Sterling backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a family secret. This was something much worse. Thaddeus raised his remote again, but this time, He pointed it at Sterling's phone, which was sitting in his pocket. "Check your bank balance, Sterling," Thaddeus said with a grin. "Check it right now." Sterling pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers slick with sweat. He tapped the screen, and the banking app flickered to life. The numbers on the screen began to spin, descending so fast they were a blur. 1 billion, 500 million, 10 million. In less than 10 seconds, the balance hit zero. "What did you do?" Sterling's voice was a ragged whisper. "I didn't do anything," Thaddeus replied, his smile widening. "You did. When you stepped onto this property, you triggered a security protocol your father set up years ago. You've been declared legally incompetent. Your assets didn't just vanish, Sterling. They were transferred to the heir of the Sterling legacy, to Zion." Suddenly, the roar of multiple engines filled the air. Bright headlights cut through the gloom of the shack's interior as 3 more vehicles pulled up behind the black SUV. Men in suits, Sterling's own board members, and his head of security stepped out. Among them was Sterling's cousin Elias, a man who had always lived in Sterling's shadow. Elias walked toward the shack, holding a tablet. He looked at Sterling with a mixture of pity and calculated disgust. Behind him, a small crowd of neighbors from the surrounding shacks began to gather, drawn by the commotion and the bright lights of the luxury cars. "Sterling, what is this?" Elias asked, pointing the tablet's camera at Odessa, who was still huddled in the corner. "The news is already breaking. The billionaire Sterling found in a drug-infested shack with a dead woman and a kidnapped girl. The stock is plummeting. They're calling for your arrest." Sterling looked at the crowd. The people he had grown up with were staring at him, whispering. They didn't see a successful man. They saw a liar who had pretended his mother was dead while he lived in a palace. He felt a wave of crushing shame. "It's not what it looks like," Sterling shouted at the crowd, but his voice was drowned out by the flashing lights of camera phones. "Look at the boy." Elias Sterling pointed at Zion, whose hands were still glowing with those rhythmic, pulsing numbers. "Look at what they've done to him." Elias looked at Zion, then back at Sterling. He didn't see the glowing numbers. He didn't see the serial code. On the tablet's screen, Zion appeared as a perfectly normal, crying child. "There's nothing on his hands, Sterling," Elias said, his voice cold. "You're having a breakdown, just like your father before he died." Thaddeus stepped forward and handed the white teddy bear to Elias. "The boy is the rightful owner of Sterling Global now. And as his legal guardian, I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave, or be removed." Sterling looked at Zion. The boy was staring at his own hands, then at Sterling. For the first time, a tear rolled down Zion's cheek. He reached out a small, glowing hand toward Sterling's face. But as Zion's fingers brushed Sterling's skin, a sharp, electronic screech erupted from the tablet Elias was holding. The screen shattered in Elias' hands. The crowd gasped and backed away. Zion's eyes didn't just look amber anymore. They were shifting. "Sterling," Odessa whispered, her voice filled with a new kind of horror. "Check the boy's pulse. Not his wrist, his neck." Sterling reached out, his hand shaking, and pressed 2 fingers against the side of Zion's throat. He didn't feel a heartbeat. He felt a steady, high-speed whirring. And then Zion spoke. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was a recorded message from the bank's main server. "Identity confirmed." The boy's mouth moved, but the sound came from his chest. "Initiating phase 2 of the inheritance." Thaddeus's face went pale. He fumbled for his remote, but Zion turned his head with a mechanical snap, his eyes locking onto the lawyer. "Phase 2, Sterling asked, backing away. "Mother, what is phase 2? Odessa didn't answer. She pointed toward the SUV, where the guard holding Clara was suddenly frozen in place, his eyes rolling back in his head. A silver liquid began to seep out of Zion's ears, dripping onto the dirt floor. "It was never a ritual," Odessa cried out. "It was an upload." Sterling stared at the silver liquid pooling on the floor. It didn't look like blood. It looked like mercury. He looked at Odessa, who was trembling so hard she had to lean against the rotting wall for support. The upload, the ritual, the words spun in his mind until they curdled into a bitter realization. He looked at Zion, who was standing perfectly still, his amber eyes now glowing with a synthetic, golden light. Sterling didn't see a brother anymore. He didn't see a child. He saw a weapon, a high-tech insurance policy designed to replace him. "You know," Sterling said, his voice dripping with venom. He turned to Odessa, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't stay here to protect me. You stayed here to build him." Odessa reached out a scarred hand, her eyes pleading. "Sterling, no. It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" Sterling snapped. He stepped back, away from her touch. "You let me mourn you for 15 years. You let me grow up alone, driven by the guilt of a fire I thought killed you. And all that time, you were in this shack, working with Thaddeus to create a better version of a Sterling heir. A version that wouldn't talk back. A version that could be controlled by a remote." He pointed at Zion, whose chest was still emitting that low, mechanical whirring. "You didn't fake her death to save my life, Mother. You faked her death to give birth to a machine. You used my DNA, didn't you? That's why he has my eyes. He's not my brother. He's my replacement." Thaddeus regained his composure, stepping over the shattered glass of the tablet. He looked at Zion with renewed fascination. "He's more than a replacement, Sterling. He's the ultimate asset. And your mother was the only one who could provide the biological framework to make the interface stable." Sterling felt a wave of nausea. He looked at his mother's scarred hands. The burns weren't from a house fire. They were from chemicals, from laboratory accidents. "How much did they pay you?" Sterling hissed. "Was my billion-dollar empire not enough? Did you need a piece of the technology too?" Odessa sank to her knees, sobbing into her hands. "Sterling, please. Your father. He never left us a choice. He said if I didn't stay, they would come for you when you were still a boy. I did this to keep the target off your back." "Liar!" Sterling screamed. He grabbed the rusted iron poker Zion had dropped and swung it at a shelf of old jars, shattering them. He didn't believe her. Every sacrifice she claimed to have made now felt like a calculated move in a long-term corporate merger. His childhood memories of her tucking him in felt like a simulation. As Sterling turned to leave, Zion's head tilted 30 degrees to the left. The silver liquid on the floor began to vibrate, creeping toward Sterling's shoes like a living shadow. Phase 2 Asset Acquisition. Zion's voice echoed, cold and hollow. Suddenly, the black SUV's headlights flickered and turned blood red. The doors locked with a simultaneous heavy thud. But it wasn't Thaddeus who held the remote anymore. Zion lifted his hand, and the silver liquid leaped from the floor, wrapping around Sterling's ankle like a cold, metal shackle. "Mother!" Sterling yelled, his anger turning to sudden, sharp panic. "Stop him." Odessa looked up, her face pale. She wasn't looking at Zion. She was looking at the white teddy bear Zion was still clutching. A hidden compartment in the toy's chest had opened, and a small, glass vial filled with a dark blue gas was beginning to hiss. "It's not an upload of data, Sterling," Odessa whispered in terror. "It's an upload of a soul. And he needs a host." The blue gas began to fill the small shack, and Sterling realized with a jolt of horror that Zion wasn't looking at the crowd outside. He was looking at Sterling's open mouth. The blue gas swirled around Sterling's face, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. He kicked violently at the silver shackle around his ankle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Odessa, who was still on her knees, her eyes wide with a paralyzed kind of grief, to Sterling. Her tears were just another layer of the simulation. "You want a host," Sterling roared, his voice thick with the rising gas. "You spent 15 years building this monster to steal my life. Fine, take it. Take everything." In a fit of blind rage, Sterling didn't run for the door. He lunged for the small wooden crate where the government envelope and the microcassettes lay. He grabbed the heavy iron poker and smashed the lockbox with a single, bone-shaking blow. Sterling, no. The tapes are the only proof, Odessa screamed, reaching out to stop him. Sterling didn't listen. He shoved her away with a cold, forceful hand. Proof of what? That you're a traitor. That my father was a coward. He began nabbing the microcassettes, snapping the thin plastic reels with his bare hands. He threw the pieces into the fireplace, where a small ember still glowed. The tapes melted into a black, toxic sludge. He wasn't just destroying data, he was trying to murder his own past. Thaddeus stood by the door, watching the destruction with a chilling calmness. He didn't try to save the tapes. He just looked at his watch. You're making this very easy for us, Sterling, Thaddeus said. By destroying the evidence of your father's survival, you are erasing your own claim to the estate. You're doing the work for us. Sterling ignored him. He turned his fury back toward Zion. The boy stood motionless, his mouth open, the blue gas pouring out of him like a silent scream. Sterling grabbed a heavy, wool-stained blanket from the cot and threw it over the child's head, hoping to smother the source. I'm ending this, Sterling hissed. He grabbed Zion by the shoulders, intending to drag him out into the rain and throw him into the mud. You're not my brothers. You're a virus. But as his hands clamped down on the boy's shoulders, Zion's skin didn't feel like plastic or metal. It felt warm. It felt human. For a split second, the mechanical whirring stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic thumping. A heartbeat. Sterling froze. His anger faltered for a heartbeat, his mind reeling. Was it a trick? Or was the upload already merging with something real? Before he could pull the blanket back, a heavy vibration shook the shack. The black SUV outside exploded, not with fire, but with a pulse of blue light that shattered every window in the building. The silver liquid around Sterling's ankle suddenly tightened, dragging him toward the center of the room. He looked at the white teddy bear on the floor. The vial was empty now, but a small, digital display on the bear's chest had flickered to life. It wasn't a serial number this time. It was a countdown. 059. The host is rejected. Zion's voice spoke, but it wasn't coming from the boy anymore. It was coming from the speakers of the SUV, the tablet, and Sterling's own dead phone. Sterling, look at the boy's neck again, Odessa shrieked, her voice cracking with terror. Sterling ripped the blanket off. Zion's amber eyes were gone. In their place were two hollow sockets, glowing with a deep, pulsing blue. And on the side of his neck, the whirring hadn't stopped. It was accelerating. Zion lifted a hand and pointed at the fireplace where the tapes were melting. The black sludge began to rise, forming into the shape of a human hand. The host isn't the boy, Thaddeus whispered, backing out of the door. The host is the Sterling bloodline, and you just gave it exactly what it needed to wake up. As the countdown hit 30 seconds, the door to the shack slammed shut, and the sound of heavy metal bolts sliding into place echoed through the room. Sterling was trapped inside with his mother, the boy, and a shadow that was beginning to scream with his father's voice. The shadow rising from the fireplace stretched toward the ceiling, its liquid fingers dripping with the remains of the destroyed tapes. Sterling backed away until his shoulders hit the locked door. The metal bolts felt ice cold through his shirt. He was a billionaire, a man who controlled markets and moved mountains with a single phone call. But in this rotting shack, he was nothing but prey. 015, the speakers croaked in his father's distorted voice. Odessa crawled toward Zion, her hands reaching for the boy who was no longer a boy. But as she touched his arm, a sharp blue spark threw her backward. She hit the floor hard, her eyes rolling back. Sterling rushed to her side, grabbing her scarred hands. Her pulse was thready, disappearing beneath his touch. "Mother, wake up," Sterling yelled, but she remained limp. Outside, the crowd of neighbors and board members had vanished, replaced by the blinding, rhythmic strobing of the SUV's red and blue lights. He was trapped in a box of his own making. He had destroyed the tapes. He had nixed the evidence. He had treated his mother like a criminal and the boy like a virus. Zion tilted his head. The blue light in his sockets flared, and the silver liquid on the floor suddenly surged upward, coating the walls, the ceiling, and the door. It was sealing the shack, turning it into a seamless, airtight tomb. "The inheritance is complete," Zion said. His voice was no longer mechanical. It was perfectly clear. It sounded exactly like Sterling. Sterling looked down at his own hands. The same glowing serial numbers he had seen on the boy were now appearing under his own skin, pulsing in time with the whirring in Zion's neck. His fortune was gone. His fiancée was a hostage. His mother was dying in his arms, and his very identity was being overwritten by a ghost in a machine. 005. The liquid hand from the fireplace reached out and grabbed Sterling's throat. It didn't squeeze. It began to pour into his mouth, cold and thick like mercury. Sterling tried to scream, but the silver sludge filled his lungs, silencing him. As his vision began to fade into a dark, digital blue, he saw Thaddeus's face through the small, reinforced glass of the door. The lawyer wasn't smiling anymore. He was knelling. "Long live the king," Thaddeus whispered. The countdown hit 0. The whirring stopped. The shack went pitch black. In the total darkness, a single, tiny sound emerged from the corner where Zion stood. It wasn't a mechanical whir. It was the soft, muffled crying of a real 6-year-old child. "Daddy," the boy whispered. But Sterling couldn't answer. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel his heart. He felt only a cold, vast network of data where his soul used to be, and then a new voice whispered inside his own head. "Thank you for the body, son. I've been waiting 15 years to get back to work." The darkness in the shack didn't stay black. It began to pulse with a deep, rhythmic amber light. Sterling tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead. He wasn't in control anymore. Inside his mind, a flood of memories that weren't his began to unlock. He didn't see the fire from 15 years ago as a tragedy. He saw it through his father's eyes as a stage. He saw his father, Sterling Sr., standing in this very shack, handing a suitcase of cash to Thaddeus. The fire hadn't been an accident to kill Odessa. It was a smokescreen to hide a global debt that would have ended the Sterling name forever. "You see it now, don't you?" the voice in his head whispered. It was his father, but it was also a system. "I didn't leave you because I didn't love you. I left so I could build a version of us that could never die." The silver liquid began to retreat from Sterling's throat, sliding back into the floorboards like a receding tide. Sterling collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His lungs burned, but his vision was sharper than it had ever been. He looked at Zion. The boy was no longer glowing. He was huddled in the corner, clutching the white teddy bear, his small body shaking with real human sobs. Zion looked up, and for the first time, his eyes weren't synthetic. They were wet with tears. "Liz, is he gone?" Zion whispered. His voice was no longer a recording. It was the voice of a terrified child. Sterling turned to his mother. Odessa was stirring, her breath coming back in ragged gasps. She looked at Zion, then at Sterling, and her eyes filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. She grabbed Sterling's arm, her scarred fingers digging into his skin. "Sterling, look at the back of the teddy bear," she choked out. Sterling grabbed the toy. He ripped open the Velcro seam on its back. There was no motherboard. There was no silver liquid. Inside the bear was a single, old-fashioned glass vial filled with a simple, amber fluid and a handwritten note on a piece of yellowed parchment. The note was in his father's true handwriting. "Forgive me, Odessa. The technology was always a lie. I needed Thaddeus to believe I was a god so he would fund your protection. Zion is my son, Sterling. He is your blood. He is as real as you are. Sterling looked at Thaddeus, who was still kneeling outside the glass door, his eyes fixed on Zion. The lawyer believed he had just witnessed a digital miracle. He believed he was the guardian of a machine. Sterling realized the truth in a flash of blinding realization. There was no upload. There was no soul transfer. It was a massive, 15-year-old psychological trap. The serial numbers under the skin were just light reactive ink. The silver liquid was a harmless magnetic ferrofluid. His father had played Thaddeus for a fool, using the lawyer's greed for immortality to keep his hidden family alive in the only place Thaddeus would never suspect the dirt. But as Sterling reached for the door handle to confront Thaddeus, he felt a sharp, real coldness at the base of his neck. He reached back and pulled away a small, metallic disc that had been stuck to his skin since he arrived. It was a neuroinhibitor, a device used to cause hallucinations. Sterling looked at the melted tapes in the fireplace. They weren't tapes. They were just pieces of black plastic. He hadn't destroyed the evidence. He had destroyed a distraction. He looked at the floorboards where the lockbox had been. It was gone. In its place was a small, digital keypad built into the foundation of the house. The real inheritance isn't the money, Sterling, Odessa whispered, standing up with Zion in her arms. And it isn't the boy. Your father didn't build an empire. He built a cage for the man who actually started the fire. She pointed her finger at the black SUV. The man who had been holding Clara wasn't a guard. As he stepped into the light, Sterling saw the man's face clearly for the first time. It was his cousin Elias. And Elias wasn't holding a tablet anymore. He was holding the real remote. He's not waiting for the upload to finish, Odessa said. He's waiting for the shack to reach the right temperature. Sterling looked at the fireplace. The toxic sludge wasn't just plastic. It was beginning to hiss, and the smell of white phosphorus filled the room. The countdown on the teddy bear hadn't stopped at 0. It had started over. And this time, it was counting up. The hiss from the fireplace grew sharper, like 1,000 snakes waking up at once. Sterling stared at the melting black plastic, his heart sinking. He looked at Odessa's scarred hands that had spent 15 years in the dirt just to keep him alive. While he had spent those same years resenting her death, he looked at Zion, a brother he had just called a virus, who was now trembling and reaching for his hand. I'm sorry, Sterling whispered, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. Mother Zion. I was so blind. He didn't wait for a response. There was no time for tears. He lunged toward the digital keypad hidden beneath the floorboards. His fingers were shaking, but his mind was finally clear. The neuroinhibitor was gone. The hallucinations were fading. He realized now that his father hadn't left him a billion-dollar company. He had left him a choice: be a Sterling who buys his way out, or be a Sterling who fights his way through. Elias stood outside by the SUV, his thumb hovering over the remote. He wasn't looking for a digital soul anymore. He was waiting for the phosphorus to ignite, to turn this shack into a permanent tomb for the only people who knew his secret. The code, Mother. What is the code? Sterling shouted, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Odessa didn't speak. She grabbed Sterling's hand and pressed his thumb onto a small, hidden sensor at the edge of the keypad. It wasn't a number. It was a biometric lock. It's not a number, Sterling, she said, her voice steady for the first time. It's a blood match. Your father knew only you could open this. The keypad turned green. A heavy clunk resonated through the foundation. But instead of the door opening, a secret floor panel beneath the fireplace slid back, revealing a narrow, concrete tunnel leading deep into the earth. Sterling grabbed Zion first, hoisting the boy onto his shoulder. Then he reached for Odessa. But as he pulled her toward the opening, he heard a sharp asterisk click from the ceiling. A secondary lock. The door to the shack didn't just stay closed, it was being reinforced from the outside. Thaddeus was no longer nailing. He was standing, watching the phosphorus smoke thicken, a look of cold realization on his face. I knew he'd been played, and now he wanted everyone dead. Go, Sterling. Take the boy. Odessa shoved him toward the tunnel. No, I'm not leaving you again, Sterling roared. He grabbed a heavy iron bar and jammed it into the sliding floor panel, forcing it to stay open. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his broken luxury watch, the one Zion had pointed to earlier. He realized now it wasn't just a tracker. He pried open the back casing with his fingernails, revealing a small silver key. Zion said one word. Sterling remembered, looking at the boys. He didn't say tracker. He said key asterisk. He shoved the silver key into a slot on the keypad. The whirring in the walls changed pitch. Outside, the black SUV's engine began to scream, the headlights flashing a violent, blinding white. But as the tunnel door fully opened, Sterling saw something at the bottom of the stairs that made him freeze. It wasn't an exit. It was a control room, filled with monitors showing every corner of his own headquarters. And on the main screen was a live feed of his fiancée Clara. But she wasn't in the SUV anymore. She was standing in his own boardroom, holding a suitcase, and she was smiling at a man whose face was still hidden in the shadows. Elias isn't the one in charge, Odessa whispered, staring at the screen. Sterling, look at the man sitting in your chair. Sterling stared at the monitors in the underground bunker, his breath coming in shallow gasps above him. The shack was beginning to roar with the heat of the white phosphorus. He could hear the wood groaning, the sound of Thaddeus screaming orders outside, but his eyes were locked on the screen. Clara, his fiancée. She was standing in the Sterling Global boardroom, 500 miles away. She wasn't a hostage. She was opening the primary vault, handing stacks of black market bonds to the man in the high-back chair. We have to stop the transmission, Sterling, Odessa urged, her voice trembling as she clutched Zion to her chest. If those bonds are logged, the Sterling name becomes a front for every criminal organization in the country. Your father built this room to prevent exactly that. Sterling didn't hesitate. He lunged for the main console, his fingers, once used to signing billion-dollar mergers, now flew across the mechanical switches of a system built 20 years ago. He found a red lever labeled asterisk, emergency broadcast override. He pulled it. Suddenly, the screen showing his boardroom flickered. The speakers in the bunker crackled to life, and Sterling's own voice, his real, unedited voice, began to blast through the intercom system of his corporate headquarters. This is Sterling, he roared into the bunker's microphone. The vault is compromised. Security. Lockdown Sector 7, Clara. Look at the camera. On the monitor, Clara froze. She looked directly at the lens, her smile vanishing into a mask of pure terror. But the man in the chair didn't move. He simply raised a hand and turned the chair around. Sterling's heart stopped. The man wasn't his father. It wasn't Thaddeus. It was the head of the National Bank, the man who had supposedly verified Sterling's bankruptcy an hour ago. I'm taking the boy, Sterling, the man said through the monitor, his voice cold and amplified. You have 60 seconds until the gas in that tunnel becomes lethal. Choose. Save the legacy or save the mother. Sterling looked at the console. There was a second button, a blue one. It was labeled ventilation, but beside it was a red light. To activate the ventilation in the bunker, he had to manually disconnect the server uplink. If he saved his mother and Zion from the rising heat, he would lose the connection to the boardroom. The bonds would be stolen. His name would be ruined forever. He looked at Zion. The boy was holding his father's old lighter again, flicking the flame. Zion wasn't looking at the screens. He was looking at a small, brass pipe running along the floor of the bunker. What? Zion whispered, pointing at the pipes. Water is coming, Sterling. Sterling realized it wasn't just a ventilation system. It was a self-destruct mechanism for the data. If the temperature rose too high, the room would flood to protect the biological assets, his mother and brother. But the flood would drown them. Sterling grabbed the iron bar he had brought down from the shack. He didn't press a button. He began to smash the main server rack. Sterling, what are you doing? Odessa cried. I'm not playing their game, Sterling hissed. He ripped the heavy silver cables from the wall, sparks flying and stinging his skin. As the boardroom feed cut to static, Sterling grabbed a small, black drive that ejected from the console. The real data. The real inheritance. He turned to the concrete stairs, but the ceiling of the bunker began to crack. The phosphorus from the shack above was melting through the reinforced concrete. A drop of liquid fire fell, landing inches from Zion's feet. Sterling threw his suit jacket over the boy and shoved his mother toward a small, circular hatch in the back of the room. Go. There's an old storm drain, he commanded. He stayed behind, his hands burning as he fought to turn the heavy iron wheel of the hatch. As the water began to hiss into the room, Sterling looked back at the monitors one last time. A new image appeared on the static-filled screen. It wasn't the boardroom. It was a GPS coordinate, flashing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And below it, a single sentence appeared in his father's handwriting. The fire didn't start in the shack, Sterling. It started in the water. The bunker began to flood. Sterling shoved Odessa and Zion through the hatch just as the ceiling collapsed, but a heavy piece of debris pinned his leg to the floor. Sterling, Odessa shrieked, reaching back through the rising water. Sterling looked at the black drive in his hand, then at the coordinate on the screen. He realized with a jolt of terror that the upload Thaddeus wanted wasn't a digital soul. It was a launch code. And Zion wasn't the key. He was the target. Run, Sterling yelled as the water reached his chest. Find the boat. Don't let them see his eyes. The water roared into the bunker, ice cold and relentless. Sterling's leg was trapped under a jagged slab of concrete, the pressure crushing his bone. He watched through the rising spray as Odessa and Zion disappeared into the dark storm drain. He was alone. The monitors hissed as the salt water hit the circuits, flickering one last time. The coordinate in the Atlantic blinked. The launch code. The black drive in his hand felt like it weighed a ton. Sterling took a deep breath, submerged his head, and used the iron bar to pry the debris off his leg with a scream that was swallowed by the flood. Suddenly, a hand reached through the hatch. It wasn't Odessa's scarred hand. It was a large, powerful hand wearing a familiar signet ring. With a violent tug, Sterling was pulled through the water and into the narrow storm drain. He coughed, spitting out silt, and looked up. A man stood in the shadows of the tunnel, wearing a simple fisherman's coat. His face was aged, but his eyes were the same amber as Sterling's. It was him. Sterling Sr. The shack had to burn, Sterling, his father whispered, his voice gravelly and real. It was the only way to make Thaddeus and the bank think they had won. They emerged from the drain onto a private dock. Miles away from the burning shack, a small, nondescript boat sat waiting in the fog. Odessa and Zion were already on board. The boy ran to Sterling, hugging his wet knees. Zion reached into his pocket and handed Sterling a small, metallic object. It was the tracking disc Sterling had pulled from his neck earlier, but now, it was glowing green. It's not a tracker, Daddy, Zion said, his voice soft. It's the heartbeat. Sterling looked at the black drive in his hand, then at his father. He realized the payoff wasn't the money or the company. It was the truth. The National Bank head Thaddeus, Clara, they hadn't just stolen his assets. They had activated a system that was now tracking the drive Sterling held. They're coming for the boat, Sterling said, looking at the horizon where the lights of a dozen helicopters were beginning to appear. His father smiled a cold, knowing look. He pointed to the black drive. Open the port on the side, son. Sterling slid a small panel on the drive. Inside wasn't a chip. It was a biological sample, a small vial of the same blue liquid Zion had breathed earlier. They wanted a launch code, Senior said as the boat's engine roared to life. But they didn't realize the code is only half of the key. The other half is sitting right there. He pointed at Zion's eyes. As the helicopters drew closer, Zion didn't look afraid. He stared out at the dark water, and his amber eyes began to pulse with a rhythmic, golden light. On the horizon, the lights of the approaching helicopters suddenly flickered and died, one by one. They began to drop into the ocean like falling stars. The fire didn't start in the shack Sterling. His father repeated, looking at the sinking wreckage. And it isn't over. We're going to the coordinates. Sterling looked at his mother, who took his hand, her scars finally resting in the light. He looked at Zion, his brother, the boy who was both a child and a guardian. The Sterling name wasn't ruined. It was being reborn in the middle of the ocean. But as the boat sped into the fog, Sterling noticed one thing. The black drive in his hand wasn't just a drive. It was beginning to hum. And from the speakers of the boat's radio, a new voice emerged. A woman's voice. Sterling, it's Clara. I'm on the ship. Don't trust the man standing next to you. Sterling looked at his father. His father didn't blink. He just kept staring into the dark. What if the man who saved him wasn't his father at all? Sometimes, the people we lose are the only ones who can truly find us. But the cost of the truth is often higher than any fortune. Sterling found his mother and a brother he never knew. Yet he realizes that in a world built on shadows, even a father's hand might be a beautiful lie. If you were standing on that boat, looking into those amber eyes, would you stay for the truth or jump for your life? What do you think Clara meant by her warning?